Good morning and welcome to the Wilson Center. I'm Haleh Esfandiari, the director of the Middle East program. The Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars is the living national memorial to President Wilson, established by Congress in 1968. It's a non-partisan institution engaged in the study of national and world affairs. The Wilson Center establishes and maintains a neutral forum for free, open, and informed dialogue. The center provides a link between the world of ideas and the world of policy, and fostering research, study, discussion, and collaboration among a full spectrum of individuals concerned with policy and scholarship in national and world affairs. We are delighted today to host this meeting on the U.S., Hamas, and the pursuit of Israeli-Palestinian peace, a discussion with Elliot Abrams, who is for the first time here. He's a good friend, and welcome, Elliot. And Bob Pastor, with whom we have had a number of meetings, and he had been at the center several times. Aaron David Miller, my colleague and friend, is going to chair the meeting today. Mr. Miller is currently a public policy scholar at the Woodrow Wilson Center and is the author of the book, The Much Too Promised Land, America's Elusive Search for Arab-Israeli Peace. He served as president of Seeds of Peace, a nonprofit organization dedicated to empowering young leaders from regions of conflict by providing them with the leadership skills required to advance coexistence and reconciliation. For the previous 2 decades, he served as an advisor to 6 secretaries of state, helping formulate U.S. policy on the Middle East and the Arab-Israeli peace process. I think I will stop here. You have the biography of our speakers, and I just would like to remind you, please close your cell phones and Blackberries because it interferes with the live webcast that we have. Aaron, you have the floor, please.
Good morning and welcome to the Woodrow Wilson Center. Hal, it's always a pleasure anytime I get to share a podium or an event with you. And I'm very pleased to be here with Elliot and Bob for what promises to be a lively and productive discussion. Of all the complexities and conundra that currently beset the pursuit of Israeli-Palestinian peace, none seem more challenging to me than the problem of a divided and somewhat dysfunctional Palestinian national movement. Questions that were presumably laid to rest in 1993 with the beginnings of the Oslo process over who would represent the Palestinian people, who would control resources, seem to be open once again. And this time it's not a question simply of a contest for parliamentary seats or representation at international conferences. It's a fundamental competition between 2 movements who control 2 different militaries in 2 separate locations with 2 different sets of ideologies and 2 different patrons. And perhaps, although this is an arguable proposition, and we should clearly argue about it, 2 different approaches to the whole question of what Israeli-Palestinian peace should mean and how to get there. Some wags in Washington and elsewhere now talk about a 3-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, not a 2-state. I think that's somewhat overdone, but it does reflect, it seems to me, part of the problem that exists. More fundamentally, I would argue 50 years after its creation, the Palestinian national movement still lacks a coherent, cohesive, unified approach to realize its national aspirations, either through armed struggle or through diplomacy. Most national movements in history, the Viet Cong, the FLN in Algeria, unify their movements through violence, through co-optation, and are able to produce one face to the world. In this particular case, that has not been true, and there may be many reasons for it, but it does confront the solutionists, particularly the Obama administration, with a problem. And the options are not good ones. Government is a question of always finding options, not between the good options and the bad ones, but between the bad ones, perhaps, and the worst ones. And it seems to me there may be four broad approaches: containment, confrontation, co-optation, and constructive engagement. Call them the four C's, if you will, of how to deal, potentially, how to deal with the issue of a divided Palestinian movement. To help us sort through all of this, I can think of no two better individuals than Elliot and Bob. Both have been in Washington for a long time. Both have advised presidents as well as secretaries of state. Both know that policy is never a question of an ideal pursuit, but always about finding the balance between what's possible and what's probable. And both, I suspect, have fairly strong opinions on these matters. It's important, very important, it seems to me, that we don't create a dialogue, so to speak, of the deaf on this issue, that we see a full range of perspective, a full range of options for how to deal with, I would argue, one of the most, if not the most, contentious problem that will confront any prospect of a conflict-ending solution between Israelis and Palestinians. The format is quite simple. Bob will speak first, followed by Elliot. Each of them can use their 15 minutes in any way they would like. I may be able to restrain myself. If I can, I'll offer a few brief comments, and then we will go to your questions and answers. And by the way, I'll say this again after they conclude. Questions and answers. Questions and answers. Not political speeches and not station identification. I appreciate the fact this is a contentious, passionate subject, but I'm urging everyone to be respectful of the time we have, as well as courteous to the views of others in the room so that we can hear as many different questions as possible. So, with that brief introduction, Bob, yes, you may.
Thank you very much, Aaron. I was in Lebanon for the elections last June in the south, observing the elections, and my interpreter was a young woman who was dressed with a hijab and a scarf that covered her face, and she tried to be very neutral, but towards the end I asked her who she really supported in the election, and she said Hezbollah. And I asked her why, and she said two reasons. Number one, Hezbollah supports women's rights more than any other party. And I said, oh. And then I said, what's number two? And she says, the second reason is that Hezbollah guys are hot. I said to myself, I missed that. I tried to keep up with the newspapers and the press on the Middle East, but somehow I missed that. And I think anybody who really spends time talking with one's adversaries in the Middle East cannot help but realize that there's a lot that we're missing. And it's that much harder if you don't talk to them or if you keep your eyes closed. And to a great extent, that characterizes the way in which the United States has been dealing with Hamas, as well as Israel has been dealing with Hamas, as well as, to a certain extent, up until recently, with regard to Syria as well. I think it's worth keeping in mind when President Bush gave a speech, perhaps Elliot wrote it for him in May of 2008, and he said that the lesson of Adolf Hitler is don't negotiate with terrorists. That he was staying at the King David Hotel where 61 years before another terrorist planted several bombs that killed 91 people and that injured 45 people. But that same terrorist made the transition to being an extraordinary peacemaker, Menachem Begin. And there is still a possibility for other people who use acts of terrorism to make that same kind of journey. Aaron's given us 4 questions to ask, and I'll try to run through them as quickly as I can. The first question is how to assess Obama's policy to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I think in a relatively short time, he moved the United States from what Aaron has described as being the lawyer for Israel to being an honest broker and of gaining credibility among Arabs and among the Palestinians, and that was not easy to do. He appointed George Mitchell, who is expert at mediation and who is quite deliberate and a great statesman. I think that was another very important act. He focused on two issues. First is the importance of a two-state solution, and second, the importance of freezing the settlements. And those were the right issues to focus on. All of the Palestinians, both Fatah and Hamas, are in agreement of a two-state solution. But there was some question as to whether Prime Minister Netanyahu would accept a two-state solution, and after much give and take in his Bar Ilan speech, he did accept it. On settlements, it's been a bit different. Since the roadmap in 2003, in which the Israelis had promised to dismantle any settlements that had been built since March of 2001 and to freeze settlements, including natural growth, there has been an extraordinary expansion of settlements. Indeed, there's been a secular expansion all the way since Camp David. And those numbers today have seen an increase from 116,300 to 289,600. In East Jerusalem, from 152,000 to 186,000. And if you travel the West Bank and you meet with moderate leaders like Salam Fayyad, they are clear that any further expansion makes it impossible for them to lead in a moderate direction, makes it impossible for them to negotiate. They see it as a clear sign that Israel really doesn't want peace, but does want to annex more and more of the Palestinian land. So I think the president was wise in focusing on that. And if Netanyahu were serious about peace, he would have seen it as a favor. Because what's the point of expanding settlements now if within a year you have to dismantle them, particularly given the enormous cost of dismantling them? Still, another reason why he might have acceded to the United States, if he is as concerned about Iran as they claim, the last thing he would want to do is to make the president seem like a paper tiger, that he could not even deliver on a freeze in settlements with his ally. Then how can he deliver vis-a-vis Iran? But of course, the government moved in the opposite direction. It insists on completing 2,500 units, expanding 450, and most importantly, of taking much more expansive role in East Jerusalem, which is viewed by the Palestinians as a provocation and may very well lead to terrible violence in the days and weeks ahead. In his UN speech, President Obama, however, wanted to move negotiations along. He declared the expansion of settlements illegitimate, but he also tried to overcome the view of Abu Mazen, who had said that a precondition to negotiation was an end to that. So in summary, with regard to an overall judgment, I think the president has been outstanding in defining a comprehensive approach, as he did in Cairo, of moving towards becoming an honest broker, in encouraging a reduction of some roadblocks. I think he was right in focusing on settlements in two states, but there's no question the outcome of what happened in New York led to some impugning of his credibility by the Palestinians and by others. And of course, there's no negotiations yet. How should the United States look at Palestinian reconciliation from the perspective of the peace process? Well, up to now, we've been looking at it with our eyes closed. It's hard enough to see threats in the Middle East if your eyes are open. I think one of Israel's arguments for not pursuing peace is because the Palestinians are divided. So one might think that it would be in their interest to promote it, reconciliation, so that they do have a better partner for peace. But it is clear that the opposite has been the case, even though Israel first encouraged the development of Hamas as an alternative to the PLO and to Fatah. Obviously, their position has changed substantially since then, and together with the quartet's preconditions, it has made it impossible for the Palestinians to move towards reconciliation because there is an obvious and credible threat of cutting off all aid to the Palestinian Authority if they moved in that direction. So it's a bit disingenuous to say that your partner is divided when one of your purposes is to keep your partner divided. Now, of course, the major reason that they are divided is because the Fatah and Hamas obviously have strong views of each other. The animosity is so severe that even if the international community encouraged unity, it would be hard to accomplish that. Nonetheless, it's almost impossible if the international community discourages it. And so, therefore, the question is really, is reconciliation in our interest, in the U.S. interest? From the purpose of peace, I think it's important that some degree of reconciliation is essential. But the really important, the really correct questions, is it better for the peace process and Israel that Hamas be crushed, or is it better for Hamas to be neutralized, co-opted, and persuaded to become part of the peace process? And that question is associated with the practical question. Is either strategy possible? Is it possible to crush Hamas, or is it possible to persuade Hamas? And I would say that it's clear, it was clear before the invasion of Gaza, it certainly should be even clearer since then, that it is not possible to crush Hamas. Of course, in January 2006, they won a legitimate election in the West Bank and Gaza. They reflect a body of the population which is substantial, if not a majority, at least some part of that population. After the invasion by Israel, the very next day, Hamas was in control of Gaza again. I don't think they can be crushed. The question is, can they be persuaded? And here you have to ask, is there signs of evolution? And I think there clearly is. 15 years ago, Hamas believed in a single-state solution, if you will, in which the Palestinians would dominate. Now they clearly believe in a two-state solution within 67 boundaries. It's clear that their charter calls for the destruction of Israel, but all of the statements, interviews by Hamas in the last 3 or 4 years indicates that they are prepared to accept a final status arrangement if it's approved in a referendum by all the Palestinians. With regard to violence, this is not a nihilist group. This is, however, a group that shares with Fatah the idea that resistance is legitimate in order to achieve an independent Palestinian state, and they believe that violence is one part of that resistance. On the other hand, they've also shown with the ceasefire that they are prepared to restrain their rockets as part of a ceasefire. That ceasefire ultimately broke down because, for a variety of reasons which we can get into, but because it was violated by Israel with its incursion in November 4th, and the other half of the agreement that required Israel to lift the barriers at the crossings was never fully implemented. And Hamas returned to its rockets and to its retaliation. It has said with regard to a post-agreement that it believes in a hudna, a sort of a long-term ceasefire, that they've reduced from 50 years now to 15 years. I think it's legitimate concern on the part of Israel as to whether Hamas will really accept that. But these can be explored in final status agreements on security and demilitarized state. Okay, should the United States change its approach to Hamas, and what should its policy be? I think there's the immediate question of the elections in Palestine, which are due in January of 2010. And a recent poll in Palestine indicated that 60% of the Palestinians believe that Abu Mazen will not be legitimate if there are not elections. And there are signs that Hamas and Fatah may ultimately agree to a framework that could lead to elections by June. So the question for the United States is, what should it do about those elections? I think that there are 4 options for the United States. The first option is what President Bush did He called for elections, and then he rejected them when the bad guys won the election. I think we got the worst of both worlds. It undermined the rather scant credibility that the United States about its support for democracy in the Middle East and beyond that. I think the second is to oppose or try to stop the elections. But if all Palestinians agree on the importance of the elections, why would Obama want to jump back into the hole that Bush had dug for himself before? The administration's trying to fashion a policy on democracy. This certainly wouldn't help it. A third option is to support elections but say Hamas cannot participate if they do not accept all three preconditions of the quartet. This would guarantee that there won't be a credible election in the West Bank and there will be no election in Gaza. And it will probably lead to greater instability. So the fourth option is to support elections and accept Hamas's involvement in it. And here you have three variations on that option. The first is sort of the Lebanese variation, whereby the U.S. looks to signal in various ways that if Hamas were to win, then the relationship would be quite bad. This might work, but if Hamas were to win, it would repeat the mistake of 2006, and we'll find ourselves in the same trap. We could say nothing about the outcome, but in fact back Fatah and undermine Hamas covertly. If there's little progress in the negotiations, if Israel's too heavy-handed on Gaza, then this could backfire. I'd like to propose a third way, a third option, and that is to announce that the deadline for the final status negotiations is 1 month before the election, and that the elections will therefore be a referendum on the agreement. This merges both issues. There is no way that Israel could support Abu Mazen more and that the United States could support Abu Mazen and the moderates more than to effectively and expeditiously negotiate a final status agreement. Indeed, his principal weakness is his failure to move on that. So therefore, if we join both goals, that is to say, to support free elections and at the same time support the peace process as fast as possible, that would assure both a democratic outcome and likelihood of having Fatah win the elections. Of course, this will require the United States and the quartet to translate the preconditions for dealing with Hamas into the results of negotiations. We've shown a willingness to recognize a new Lebanese government that has Hezbollah as one of its partners in that. Perhaps we could do the same with regard to Hamas. If Hamas were to accept, as it has already said, that it will recognize Israel, although it said it implicitly, as a result of the negotiations, because if it accepts an agreement, the preamble of that agreement is going to be mutual recognition. Then that should be close enough to that. With regard to a renunciation of violence, if there is a full and complete ceasefire negotiated with an agreed text between now and the elections, Hamas would have an incentive to keep to that, and then include the renunciation of violence as part of that final status agreement. And finally, the acceptance of all the agreements which Netanyahu has had some problems in accepting, but which could be part of the final status agreement, would deal with the final precondition. So, is 6 months too short? I don't think so. Everybody knows what the issues are, and the hardest issues will occur in the 1 week after they're almost at agreement in making the difficult trade-offs, for example, between Jerusalem and refugees. So, is peace possible without Palestinian unity? Well, it doesn't have to be complete unity, but what is necessary is to give Hamas an incentive not to sabotage the agreement, and I think that is quite possible. But there's an equally important question about division that needs to be raised at the end. It's not just Palestinian division that's impeding progress. It's Israeli division. What happens if parts of the Israeli coalition say, no possibility of negotiating on Jerusalem, we want a greater Israel? What happens then? And there's a problem of U.S. division. What happens if the President of the United States says, we have to stop and free settlements, and the Congress says, we shouldn't stop and free settlements? So the real problem in the Middle East is not solely division among the Palestinians, it's among the Israelis and among the U.S., and the really critical question is, how do we turn the dynamic in the Middle East away from a situation in which the violent extremes, the intransigent, are reinforcing each other to a point at which those who are really interested in peace are reinforcing each other, because there are no unitary actors anywhere in the Middle East. And you can act in a way that reinforces intransigence and a new cycle of violence, or you can act in a way which reinforces in peace. So just to summarize, I believe Obama is on the right track, but like Mark Twain once said, even if you're sitting on the right road, even if you're on the right road, if you sit down, you can get run over. And therefore, this is no time to sit down. Secondly, for the peace process to work, Hamas has to be a part of it. Some reconciliation is essential. Third, the United States should modify and work to modify the preconditions in a way that, of the quartet, in a way that encourage elections and the participation of all parties. The best way to help Fatah and Abu Mazen is to expedite negotiations. And finally, every actor in the Middle East is divided. Those who fear the future and resort to violence have always helped each other. It's now time for those who are willing to take risks for peace to help each other. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. Elliot. Thank you.
Thanks, Aaron, Bob. Those of you who are fearing this will be a dull and boring discussion because we'll all be in agreement on everything, have no fear. Whereas, as the late Pope used to say, be not afraid. We have a lot of disagreements, but let me try to do as Bob did, question by question. Starting with the policy of the Obama administration, I think Obama policy has already failed. Surely the purpose of this policy was not to weaken Abu Mazen and strengthen Netanyahu, yet it has had that impact, including the meeting, and here I think Bob and I agree, the meeting in New York, the trilateral in New York, was not a success for the president, and really not a success for Abu Mazen either. Why did this happen? I think it happened largely because the administration displayed a gross misunderstanding of the situation on the ground with its obsession with the question of settlement expansion. Why do I say obsession? The International Peace Institute in New York released a poll last week showing that Palestinians want the settlements gone. No surprise there. Settlements and outposts gone. But settlement expansion they view as a not very important question, according to the IPI poll. Now, that is not shocking if you think of it this way. It's the land question that Palestinians are mostly concerned about, and we had already had an agreement with Israel not to expand the settlements in territory. I actually thought the administration would come into office and say, well, that agreement wasn't enforced, and now, by God, we'll enforce it. But that's not what it did. It said instead, with some very tough language, particularly by the Secretary of State, freeze means freeze, not one brick. A position that I think anybody familiar with the region would have known was impossible for any Israeli prime minister to accept, not just Netanyahu. And the Israeli government didn't accept it, and we backed down. Notable when in the president's comments in New York, he used the word restraint instead of the word freeze. Now, for the president to have to back down that way does not help the United States, and it certainly doesn't help Abu Mazen or Palestinian moderates either, because when we went out on that limb, they, of course, followed. and then we chopped it off. So that's just one example of why I think Bob said the administration gained trust, but I think it has lost a lot of that trust by leaving the Palestinian Authority, Fatah, PLO, on a sawed-off limb, not knowing what the administration can really do next. So we're in a kind of a dead end, I think, now. There will, I guess, be negotiations. There are dates set. These things can slip. They often do. I think it's probably in the interest of both the PLO, I guess I should say, and the government of Israel that there be some negotiations, and I think they will meet, but I don't think that they will make much progress. There is better news, and that is that while the negotiations track is not very lively, I think, what's going on the ground in the West Bank is a lot more promising. Many of you will have seen the World Bank and IMF numbers about the West Bank, where the economy is improving. There is more mobility in the West Bank. The training by the United States in Jordan of a couple of thousand by now, I think, Palestinian police has paid off. Those police have been mobilized and put into cities in the West Bank where they are maintaining law and order, fighting terrorism, and this has allowed a certain pullback of Israeli forces. So all of that is positive. My own view is that that should be our focus. That is not what goes on at the negotiating table, but what goes on in real life on the ground in the West Bank, laying the foundation for the building of a Palestinian state. As the Palestinian Prime Minister put it, he sees his goal as building a state despite the occupation. I think that the Palestinian state will come through developments in real life on the ground, not at a negotiating table. Now, Palestinian unity and reconciliation. I think the question is really not unity and reconciliation. The question is, around what? What's the policy that's being adopted? What's the program of the government? What are the terms? For example, if you had an agreement between Fatah and Hamas to restart the Intifada, I don't think many of us would think that was a great idea. Well, that's unity and reconciliation. In fact, in the real world, I think that unity and reconciliation with Hamas means unity over its impossible demands. It means there will be no peace. It means compromise with a terrorist group. And one of the things that it will not do is strengthen moderates and moderation among Palestinians. I think it will make negotiations with Israel, if you think they're difficult now, even more difficult. And I don't see how it makes life in the West Bank better. I mean, another way of asking the question is, to achieve this reconciliation or unity, what does Hamas give up? I don't think the United States should change its approach to Hamas. To do so would strengthen and encourage the most extreme elements in Palestinian society, and it would weaken the most moderate elements. It would suggest that we think we know who the winners are, Hamas, and who the losers are, Fatah, PLO, PA. That alone would have, I think, a considerable impact if there are PA elections. I think that history suggests that negotiations with terrorists can work, if they ever can work, only when the terrorists know they are beaten, or else the negotiation strengthens them. That is certainly I would argue, the lesson of the negotiations with the IRA. So what does Hamas think? I think Hamas believes it is winning. It is ascending, particularly since the Israeli withdrawal from Gaza. If you compare Northern Ireland, which I think is worth doing, The first distinction is, of course, this question of winners, losers. The IRA began to negotiate seriously when it concluded that it had lost. Prior negotiations with it actually strengthened it. But there's another distinction that's worth drawing. The IRA was, first of all, Ireland is an island. And the IRA, even in the days of the Soviet Union, the IRA was essentially a group with a narrow and defined goal. It wasn't trying to take over England. It wanted the British out of Northern Ireland. Hamas is in a rather different situation. It's not an island in any sense of the term. It's part of the Islamic world. It is part of the Muslim Brotherhood movement. It is part of the larger Islamist movement. Its victory is a victory for terrorist groups everywhere. The IRA was cut off, if you think about the days of successful negotiations, in Dublin and in Washington and in London and in Boston. But Khalid Mashalqa was traveling around raising money in many, many Arab countries and Muslim countries. Nor is the goal of Hamas a narrow goal, a Palestinian state. Hamas's goal is to destroy Israel. And I have never seen any statement by any Hamas leader that suggested that even a long truce, 10 years, more, was anything other than a stage to form the Palestinian state, build it, strengthen it, and then you move on to the next stage, which is the destruction of Israel. I don't want to, we'll have time to talk about some of the other things we disagree on, but I guess I'd make two final points. First, I think most of you are aware that 8,000 rockets and mortars were fired from Gaza into Israel after Israel's departure from Gaza. It strikes me as remarkable for Bob to say that the real blame for that lies with Israel. Final point, the solution that is proposed, that there'll be an election in June, I guess, and we will say that 1 month before there'll be a final status agreement, so the election is a referendum on it. Why wait till May? Why don't we give them a deadline of November to do a final status agreement? This is just not realistic. These negotiations have been undertaken for 16 years without success. The notion that they're always on the verge of success, they're always an inch away, seems to me unrealistic when you think back to these 16 years. They're not an inch away. If it is true that the outlines of an agreement are clear, then the fact that neither side seems to want those terms should suggest that we are not an inch away from getting such an agreement. Which is why I go back to the idea that we should be less interested in negotiation tables and more interested in what goes on the ground. Thank you.
Elliot, thank you very much. Just a few brief comments, and then we'll go to your questions. I'm in the wonderfully anomalous position, having worked on these issues for so long and having not much to show for them, of being in a position where I can come, to paraphrase a line out of Julius Caesar, not to praise the peace process, but also not to bury it. I mean, my perspective on these matters is somewhat different. I don't want to see America fail, which is my primary objective in all of this. If I have a hidden agenda, it is that, to avoid yet another failure in war-making or peacemaking, I might add, for the United States. So let me just make a few observations. Number one, on Obama's policies, I think making this issue a top priority is critical for success. There's no question. Finding the right people to work on it is extremely important. Not since Jim Baker have we had an envoy who is a politician, who is fair, and who has a track record of success. I think the president's instincts to make this a top priority are good ones. I think he's shackled with a profoundly galactic problem. He wants a conflict-ending solution, but there may not be one available. And I would tend, I think, if Bob is suggesting that Obama's policies have been, by and large, on the mark, and Elliot has suggested that they are off the mark, I would just make one point. Saying no to the great power without consequence is not a good way to spend your first year in office. Saying no to the great power without consequence hurts American credibility. That's true for the Israeli no, and I would argue we defined an objective that could not conceivably be accomplished in the real world, comprehensive settlement freedom, including natural growth. I'm not sure to this day why we define the objectives accordingly, but the Arabs' reaction to partial normalization was also a no. That's not good. But it's only the first year. Jimmy Carter had his first year, and things turned out differently. Jim Baker had his first year, and things turned out differently. So on this one, I think it's very much a work in progress. Number two, I will pose two questions. I do not want to exaggerate the problem of what and I don't mean to trivialize this, but what I have called the Palestinian Humpty Dumpty, which is my conception of a divided and dysfunctional national movement. I think it is a critical problem. Bob is right to point out that there are differences, profound differences, that exist within this Israeli government and within the Israeli polity. And we are under all kinds of constraints here. So yes, there are divisions, but today we chose to concern ourselves with the Palestinian story. I would just pose two questions, because I do believe that trying to find an answer to this problem is absolutely critical, because the peace process is out of the age of ambiguity and trying to cobble together structures through disengagement agreements and interim accords and winks and nods and Oslo agreements and Madrids. We're way beyond that. What is required, and I'll speak as an American here, is clarity and a strategy to invest in a process that will actually work and will end the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians. That requires strong leaders on all sides, not winks and nods, not constructive ambiguities. That won't work anymore. We're way beyond that, way beyond it. Clever fixes, way beyond it. And I would pose two questions to you with respect to Palestinian disunity. Number one, does this Palestinian president have the kind of legitimacy, authority, power after the last 5 years of failing to deliver in terms of ending Israel's occupation, ending settlement activity, pushing the United States to intervene in the worst confrontation that has befallen the Palestinians in Gaza? Does he have the capacity to make decisions on Jerusalem, borders, security, and refugees against the backdrop of a divided Palestinian national movement in which resources, guns, legitimacy, and other patrons, other states, are beyond his control? That's question number one. I don't know the answer. I put it out to you. And question number two, I don't have answers, which I would argue is the beginning of all wisdom. And number two, would any Israeli prime minister make concessions on Jerusalem, borders, refugees, and security to a Palestinian president that did not have an effective monopoly over the legitimate forces of violence within his society, whether it's Washington, D.C., or Cairo, or Syria? The state controls all of the guns. Now, you can figure out a way to do that. You can sequence that any way you want. But the state controls all of the guns. And I'm not talking about the criminal enterprise. We're a walking poster child for the obverse of that fact. But that's absolutely critical. One final comment with respect to options. Governing is about choosing, That's what it is. That's what I've learned from 25 years. I'm now working on a book called Can America Have Another Great President? ? So I'm now into looking at great presidents. One of our greatest presidents, Franklin Roosevelt, said about one of probably our greatest president, Abraham Lincoln, that Lincoln died a sad man because Lincoln couldn't have everything. Governing is about choosing. Now, everyone in this room, including me for most of my professional life, elevated the Arab-Israeli conflict to the centerpiece of their worlds. It is certainly for Arabs and Israelis, that's the case. But a great power has many things to do, is very busy, and there are certain priorities and certain choices that have to be made. The problem for this administration is that it wants a conflict-ending agreement, but the odds of actually producing one, given this problem, given the divisions that exist within the Israeli polity, and given this notion that at Camp David in July of 2000, or at any point subsequent, that we have been this close to a resolution of these issues, or that everybody knows what the outcome is going to be. Of course everybody knows, but that's not the problem. The problem is the political will and the politics and the courage and the determination that is required to get there. Leadership is everything. Breakthroughs in this conflict have come under only one circumstance, when leaders were masters of their politics, not prisoners of their constituents. Sadat, Begin, Hussein, Rabin, Arafat in his first incarnation. It is authority, and in some respects, heroic action. And I don't see that anywhere. So, with that
Optimistic note.
uplifting few comments, let's go to your questions. And please identify yourself by name and organization if you choose, and ask a question, please. Yes. Way in the back. I'm sorry. Thanks, Mona.
Yeah, Chairman, freelance correspondent. I have two observations. First one is this. When there's a two warring party and their action always very violent, and it's unfair to label one side action is terrorist, and now label other side action is terrorist. And second is this. For the two warring party, if there's peace, and you have said there need of concession, and concession have to come from the strong side. Thank you.
Two-part observation.
Let's move on to some other questions. And then
Oh, you want to take another? Let's take one or two more and then come back to it. Yes.
I'm Howard Moreland, private citizen. I just came from a Sabeel conference this weekend, and the man named Jeff Halper, I don't know if you know him, but he's the Israeli Coalition Against Housing Demolitions. He stated something that was pretty well agreed by most of the people, that the Israeli occupation of the West Bank and Gaza long ago became a permanent annexation. And that as long as, if that's true, then Israel's destiny is to be an apartheid state until it ceases to be a Jewish state, because it's a country where only half the people are Jewish.
Do you have a question, or was that just a comment?
Well, I mean, it seems to me that's sort of a background to the question of whether Hamas recognizes Israel or not. If you assume that the occupation is permanent, then you're asking them to recognize an apartheid state.
Okay, next. We'll take one more and then we'll divvy them up. Yes.
I'm Barry Posen. I'm a public policy fellow here at the Wilson Center. I'm interested in the particular negotiating tactic that you talked about that the Obama administration adopted, which is this very strong statement that that settlements simply had to stop. All kinds of settlements had to stop, and building. And I'm curious, is what leverage did the Obama administration think it had to bring this about, right? Or what leverage do you think that they thought they had to bring this about? And in the end, why did they fail to bring this about? Did they pull back at exercising the leverage they thought they had? Or was this just one grand misconception? And if they had a misconception that was this large, what does it tell you about the level of expertise and understanding of the conflict?
Okay. First question, terror. What do we call terror? We could be here for 3 weeks on that one, I suspect. The issue of the strong party must make the first concessions. I think I did. I mean, when I'll tell you. Let's take the second part.
Let
of
us
the
answer
question.
it then.
Or, exactly. Should the strongest party make the first move or make the concessions?
Well, and also Barry's question as well. I think the first questioner was correct that the word terrorism often lacks critical distinctions that are important if one wants to move a conflict to a state of peace. I think it's clear that with regard to Hamas, terror is not a generalized goal. That is to say, they are not nihilists like Al-Qaeda. They use it as one instrument for the pursuit of their goal, which they declare is an independent Palestinian state, which of course was the way in which Menachem Begin used terror, and the way many so-called freedom fighters have used terror in the past as an instrument to try to pursue that particular goal. And so if one believes that that particular goal, an independent Palestinian state, is not a bad thing, and indeed, as far as I can tell, both from what Netanyahu has said and what President Obama has said, that is a shared goal, then there might be an alternative way to involve Hamas into the process, which is what I was arguing. Now, Elliot raised a very important issue in which there's no obvious answer, which is that, okay, maybe they are sincere at this time, but maybe it's part of a tactic that over the long term they're going to use to destroy Israel. Well, the short of it is that nobody really knows for sure in their minds. I don't think there's any question in my mind that there are Israelis that would wish Palestinians would disappear. And indeed, that's a part of some of the party's policies. And that there are Palestinians that wish that Israel would disappear. But I think there's a majority among both populations that have come to realize that they have to accept each other, and indeed among the Arab states. And so the question is, how do you craft a process that gives the majority a chance to succeed? I think the stronger power should move first, both U.S. and Israel, if they need to take risks. Everyone will need to take some risk for peace. At the current time, I don't see that as the strategy of the Israeli government. I think they're feeling secure and strong enough to lay back, but I think that's really a very short-term strategy. I think the status quo is not sustainable. Indeed, it could break apart at any time. We've had this wonderful moment of peace over the last 8 months where there hasn't been rockets, which we should have taken further advantage to move the process forward, but we didn't take it. And I think we have to move much more clearly. Barry's question is a good one. What leverage did Obama have? And the answer, of course, is that he's not certain. Nobody is. He did take a risk in setting this as a goal. I think by setting as a goal, he was right because it really is a critical issue. It gets to the problem that this man raised as well, that there are many Palestinians who believe that the settlements are part of a process of annexation, that Israel will never accept an independent Palestinian state. The outcome will either be an apartheid state or it will be continued occupation. And that's not acceptable to the Palestinians. So I think he was right to focus on that. But he should have asked the question you asked, and I'm sure they did, what leverage do you have? I think the principal leverage really would be, of course, our aid program, which we use with every country in the world except for Israel, for reasons that most people understand. And he knows that as well, so he couldn't use the aid program. A second potential source of leverage is that the United States will not prevent actions by the UN Security Council that condemns the expansion of settlements. And a third point of leverage is the one that he is using, but is a little more subtle, and that is we know that our relationship matters. It matters to us, and it matters to Israel, and it matters to Netanyahu. And Netanyahu feels that he may have lost the previous elections because he allowed the deterioration of the relationship. And I don't think either one wants to let this deteriorate to the point in which it hurts each politically in each country. So I think I think we're in the middle of a process right now by which Israel is starting to adjust to the U.S. as being an honest broker. And this will not be easy on either side. But I think in the long term, that's what's going to be needed if there is progress towards peace.
Thanks, Bob. Elliot?
Just on the question that Barry Posen asked, I don't know. I've asked myself this question. Did the administration, for example, ask the U.S. ambassador and the U.S. consul general or a couple of previous ambassadors, do you think that this kind of settlement freeze is going to be attainable? I doubt it. I tend to believe what's in the newspapers, which is that this is a product of George Mitchell and Rahm Emanuel's views. And, Mitchell had been out of it for 10 years, had not been involved. 8 years, not 10 years, 8 years. And he made a misjudgment. It was a very big misjudgment. And it does, I think, raise a question as to the level of their understanding of what's going on in the region. On the question of Israel and the West Bank, I would think that would have been a better discussion 5 years ago. But something happened in the interim, which was that Ariel Sharon broke the Likud party up over the question of Greater Israel or getting out of the West Bank and Gaza. And he then got out of Gaza. And when he did, he also added 4 tiny settlements in the northern West Bank for a reason, which was to show that getting out of the West Bank was possible as well. I think that the vast majority of Israelis want to get out of the West Bank and want now, post-Intifada, want separation from the Palestinians. So I don't, clearly there are portions of the Palestinian and Israeli polity that don't agree with that, but I think at this point the vast majority do. Just one comment on terrorism. If we walk away from the Middle East for a minute, the people who blew up those trains in Madrid and London were terrorists. I object very deeply to the notion that, there's both sides, who's to say. I would say the same thing about the people who blew up, now to go back to the region, a Passover Seder in the Park Hotel in Netanya or the Dolphinarium discotheque. One could give a lot of other examples. The notion that there is, which we're getting to here from some of this, is there's really no such thing as terrorism, I think is quite despicable. And I'll give you just the final example. Why is it that so many Americans were unhappy with the release of Mr. Megrahi from a Scottish jail just for downing Pan Am 103 and killing the 230 people on it? Do we not think that's an act of terrorism? Or that was just a response, that was just their response? Go down this path of gross and despicable moral relativism, and we end up in a very bad place.
One quick comment, Barry. The strategy that the administration has pursued these many months is really not a strategy designed to deal with the main issues. It's a strategy born out of the Oslo period in which you take X from one side and you get X from the other, and you try to wrap it together in a package on the assumption, the fact that you would even call it a confidence-building measure suggests to me that nothing has been learned. It's almost impossible now, 9 years after the onset of serious Israeli-Palestinian negotiations in this environment, to create the kind of confidence-building measures which are half measures. Half measure freeze from the Israelis and a half measure partial normalization from the Arabs. It won't work. It was the easy way, I would argue. The easy way. Their rhetoric and having advised secretaries of state with some bad advice about what to say early on in an administration. Tom Dine, I think, will appreciate this. You have to be very careful. Deeds matter, but words, particularly early on in administration, may matter more. Okay, let's take another two. Hala Sfandiari.
Question to all three of you. For the Obama administration, a success or a partial success, to show something is very important. Can the administration call on other Arab states to step in? I mean, let's say Saudi Arabia, because there was a peace plan proposal, or Egypt, or other countries, and how effective and how helpful can it be? And how do you marginalize Iran's influence with Hamas?
Gentlemen, actually, we'll take one more, and then it gets too complicated. We go to three. Yes, right here, and then we'll.
Thank you. I'm Benjamin Tu, an independent analyst. This is primarily for Elliot Abrams, but Bob Pastor may wish to comment as well. As the parties move to the negotiating table, it's important to assume that Netanyahu as well as Abbas are men of peace. Given that, what's wrong with strengthening Netanyahu so he has domestic support for his program and makes it seem that he's not being pushed or will not be pushed around by the Americans?
Okay. Thank you. That was straightforward and clear. We'll take one more, and then we can. Yes, in the middle. Heba.
Thank you, Heba Al-Qudsi. I'm a fellowship here in Woodrow Wilson Center. Actually, I have a question about this option about Hamas, whether to smash it or to get it participated. So the participation, that means that you admit that you are talking with a terrorist movement. So what's the other option of weakening Hamas or trying to smash it? So what's the option here, or how to do it? Thank you.
Okay.
Well, let me just, if I could, respond to Hala and to the last question, but start with Elliot's last comment. I don't want me to be misinterpreted when I was answering the question on terrorism. I think terrorism in all forms should be condemned. The critical question is, what's an effective strategy for dealing with it? And the beginning of wisdom, to use Aaron's point, is to recognize that it is very often used for different goals. And when you can identify the goals, offers you an opportunity to figure out a more effective way to deal with it. And that's what I was trying to get at. I don't think that it should ever be condoned under any circumstances. Hala asked two very good questions. I think the administration has been trying to find a way to encourage the Arab states to come forward with certain gestures that would reassure Israel. And the Arab states have been reluctant to do so unless they could see that the president meant it when he said there would be no expansion of settlements. That is to say that he was prepared to use effective leverage on Israel to make sure that this was going to count. Now that he hasn't, he's in a slightly weaker position. I think that there still is an important opportunity, and I think it would benefit the process. Steve Solarz put together a wonderful, an excellent proposal in which he suggested that several of the Arab leaders go with President Obama to Jerusalem, almost like an Anwar Sadat game changer, if you will, to state clearly their support for the Arab initiative, which is land for peace. And the Arab states right now, I don't think, would consider that in the absence of some clarity on the part of the United States as to what it is prepared to do to move Israel to the point of negotiating seriously, because they don't believe that they are. So that's the next step, is what is the president prepared to say and to do to make that happen? If he did, I think you would find the Arab states there, ready to act. I think on Iran's relationship with Hamas, you know, Ellie and I have been dealing with internal civil wars which have been manipulated by outside countries in different regions of the world over the last 30 years. And the lesson I draw from that is we always exaggerate the extent to which outsiders are manipulating insiders. The insiders usually are doing a better job of manipulating outsiders. And I think that's even true with regard to Hamas. Don't exaggerate the influence of Iran. At certain moments, the influence may be very great, but Hamas has a clear sense of what its objective is. Its objective relates to the West Bank and Gaza, to an independent Palestinian state. If you deal with that, then you can deal effectively with Iran. In the long term, Iran will be dealt with very effectively in a number of different ways. One is the negotiation of nuclear, but more importantly, if there's progress towards peace in the Middle East. And that gets to the question about what are the other options for strengthening Abu Mazen, weakening Hamas. There's no better option of all than to take Abu Mazen seriously and negotiate seriously. There's no way to weaken him greater than to not take him seriously. You've seen that over the last 3 or 4 years. So I think that's simply the best way to do that.
Elliot.
Thanks. These are very difficult questions. I think it's not going to be effective, to go to Hale's question, for the reasons that Bob states, to get the Arab states to, in a sense, help Israel or move toward Israel. I would actually like to ask them something different, which ought to be possible, which is help the Palestinians. That's tough enough. I mean, I cannot tell you how much time the Clinton and Bush administrations, and I am positive, without knowing, positive, the Obama administration is spending trying to get Arab states, for example, to meet their Arab League pledges to give money to the Palestinian Authority, to meet its payroll. That shouldn't be so hard for them to do, and it gets to the question of how do we reduce the influence of Hamas and how do we reduce the influence of Iran. I think we all assume, I hope we all assume, that Palestinians are rational actors. I have found it very interesting that opinion polls show a significant diminution in Hamas popularity in Gaza. It's not that shocking. I mean, the economy is awful, the situation's awful, and we now get the beginnings of the, I don't know what to call it, Talibanization, Wahhabization of Gaza, committees for the prevention of vice and this sort of thing. That is not a very strong pattern in past Palestinian life. Palestinians, 91% literacy, fairly secular, and this is not going to go over well. So in a way, one can argue that Hamas is going to dig its own grave. It would, and Arab states can help, as we can help, simply by improving the situation in the West Bank, and Israel can help by improving the situation in the West Bank so that the average Palestinian will look at Gaza, look at the West Bank and say, this is not close. That is the way I want to live. I don't want somebody telling me what I can wear on the beach, which is what they're now beginning to do. So I think that it is reasonable and ought to be effective to ask the Arabs to help the PA. The other question of diminishing Iran's influence, some of that influence is very concrete. It's money and guns. So we need to try to prevent more effectively the arrival of money and guns. This requires the help, again, of Arab states. For guns, it's mostly Egypt, which is doing a better job than it was, 2 years ago, but could do still a better job. For money, it's partly Egypt, but it's the other Arab states too. As I mentioned before, one can, you can Google this and look where Khalid Mashal and others from Hamas have been traveling to raise money. There is no reason why Arab governments can't say no. They don't have to make speeches about it. They can just say it's not convenient. They can close down Hamas fundraising offices. that hurts Hamas, and it helps block Iranian funds that go through other Arab countries to Hamas. On the question of strengthening Netanyahu, I would say, if we want a negotiation to succeed, I hark back to what Aaron was saying, that we want the negotiators to be stronger. We want Netanyahu and Abbas to have the ability, and I share his doubts, but we want them to have the ability to make very, very tough compromises.
Let's take several more questions. Yes, yes, I'm sorry. Yes, we do. It's coming to you, actually momentarily.
Thank you. I'm Renee Schick, and I'm in Information Services. It seems to me that there are two items that you have not addressed, and I'm really interested in. One is demographics, the Arabs in Israel, proper, and the other one is geography, the shape of the Palestinian state consisting of the West Bank and Gaza. Like it.
All right, that's one. Yes, in the front row.
Hello. My name is Doron Zimmerman. I am a professor with National Defense University here in Washington. And my question to you is, Hamas itself is not monolithic. There is an inside and an outside leadership. The outside leadership is beholden to Iranian influence, which I think is very dangerous to underestimate. And the inside leadership is usually at the receiving end from the pressure from the outside leadership. So I think that, you know, if the going gets tough, it's the likes of Haniya who get overruled by Khaled Mashal and his people. If that doesn't work, there is Palestinian Islamic Jihad, which Iran can play off against the inside leadership, is another catspaw which is accepting money from Iran. If that doesn't work, there is the disavowable public resistance committees, and so on and so forth. So what we have is a Palestinian insurance policy that says we're not responsible. We cannot be held responsible. If somebody at the negotiating table says yes, that doesn't mean yes monolithically, as you've pointed out. It means yes for a limited amount of time and only for a certain group or a splinter group. And those that determine what is happening are actually situated outside and not inside. I could add to that Hezbollah's influence in the territories. Thank you.
All right, let's try one more. Yes, in the fourth or fifth row. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. My name is Dina, and I'm just an American citizen who wants to eventually devote my life to saving this problem. We know that a majority of the attacks on Israel are not coming from political parties necessarily like Hamas, but private citizens. And you pose the question, will Israel ever really negotiate without a notion of security from these attacks? So what my question is, what needs to be done to stop these attacks, or is it even possible to control these private citizens that are basically ruining it for everyone? Thank you.
Okay, we have one question on demography. Well, let's otherwise I'm going to forget. We have one question on demography and geography. Would either of you like to address that? I mean, we have to keep our answers short, too, because time is rapidly diminishing. One on the issue that you raised with respect to the absence of monopoly over violence, which is a critically important problem. The other is pragmatism, insiders, outsiders. And your question on how do you control violence, either group or individual?
On the last one, I would just, I think Aaron said it before, that a Palestinian state's going to have a monopoly, going to have monopoly on violence. I mean, that's almost the definition of what is a state. It has to have monopoly internally on the sources of violence. I think I would disagree, though, about the source of the violence. I don't think, for example, it's private citizens in Gaza who were launching 8,000 mortars and rockets. It's Hamas and a couple of other groups sometimes associated with Hamas. So I think that problem can actually be solved. Indeed, in the West Bank, as the police begin to get competent at their jobs and to grow in size, they're dealing with that which would actually be a law and order problem. And they are they are dealing with it, I would say 2009 is a lot better than 2008, which was a lot better than 2007. I agree with the questioner about the inside and outside questions of Hamas, and more generally the problem of deniability. But it gets back to the question of monopoly on violence. That is, as Tzipi Livni once said, you can't, when Israel leaves the West Bank, you can't just throw the key over the fence. There has to be a state there that is able to maintain law and order and fight terrorism, including attacks on its neighbors, plural, not just Israel. We're not there yet. I think we're a lot better off than we were a year or two ago, but there is a great deal more progress that is needed before we will reach the point at which we can say that there is a Palestinian state or embryonic state that is actually able to maintain a monopoly on violence and prevent attacks on neighboring countries. On the demography, I would just say I think the demography is one of the main reasons that Israelis, the vast majority of Israelis, have become persuaded that they need to get out of the West Bank and separate from Palestinians.
Yeah, just to follow up on that point, and then Bob will leave the field to you to answer some of the other elements. You know, there are two factors nations can't change. One for sure is their geography, where they are, and the other is their demography, what they are. And the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has been dealt a very cruel hand with respect to both. I mean, the complexities of this problem, take out for a minute the fact that 20% of the population of the state of Israel are Israeli Arabs, Palestinian citizens of Israel, who suffer social and economic discrimination, who are also increasingly accelerating also in terms of jobs and vocations. They're contradictory trends, and their birth rate, frankly, their birth rate is diminishing, not increasing. But how will the state of Israel deal with a national minority, some of whom are increasingly identified with their co-religionists and brothers and sisters across the Green Line? Gaza West Bank corridor. I cannot tell you how much time has been spent trying to devise creative underground highways, overground highways, safe passage. I mean, it goes on. So I would argue, and I am not optimistic about this, but I would argue that once the political decisions are made with respect to conflict-ending agreements between Israelis and Palestinians, all of these problems, including the existence of a national minority, have a chance of being resolved. And that's, if I have any hope, it flows from that. Bob?
Yeah, let me address the issue about Hamas, because I've spent a lot of the last 3 years speaking with Hamas leadership, the whole Politburo with Mashal in Damascus, in the West Bank, among the PLC leadership, all of whom were subsequently imprisoned, and then now are starting to dribble out, in Beirut, with the leadership of the diaspora, with the leadership of the refugees and others, and also with Hania in Gaza. And I think it's exaggeration to suggest that they're all moving in different directions. I think there's no question they have a difficult time communicating with each other because they know that Israel and the United States are listening to every word on every cell phone and tapping into it, and sometimes they actually communicate through that in a way that leaves people to think that there are greater divisions than there actually are. But by and large, I've seen them all look at things in quite similar ways. It's difficult for them to develop policies at a moment's notice, but over time they've been quite coherent in their approach. And I think they're coherent around a set of objectives which relate to an independent Palestinian state. Now, I think one of the points that Elliot makes is very important, which is that that the effort to have a siege in Gaza and to try to crush Hamas has some counterproductive effects from his standpoint. That is to say, to the extent that you really do increase the pressure in Gaza, there is a greater likelihood that extremist groups are going to flower. And to the extent that Hamas takes a different approach from Iran, that gives Iran an incentive also to assist other different groups. But if there's one thing to be learned since the takeover by Hamas of Gaza, it's that Hamas actually can exercise a monopoly on force in Gaza. That is to say, it can turn the rockets on, or it can largely turn them off. Not completely, but when the ceasefire came into effect on June 19th, they thought that they could stop the rockets the next day. And I went to see Khania 2 weeks later, and he said, we were wrong. It takes us longer, but we're stopping it now. And from that point until November 4th, they stopped the rockets. There was only 10 rockets that went through that 4 months, as opposed to 2,000 over the previous 4 months. They stopped the rockets. They showed that they could stop the rockets. They also showed that they would start them up again if the agreement that they understood had been reached with Israel would not be adhered to by Israel. So that is a potentially encouraging step there. That is to say, they can exercise force. Now, the next step is they're showing that they're an actor. The question is, how do you get them into the process? And they have indicated over the last months that there are ways that they want to be put in the process, and they want to be involved in elections as well. Let me just make one last point on this, because I think implicit in a lot of what Elliot's suggesting is the idea that the U.S. strategy should focus on building Palestine and all of its institutions over time and helping develop it, and that will deal with the problem. I think it only deals with the problem if you take it the next step, which Fayyad has suggested, which is say, okay, at the end of 2 years, we're an independent Palestinian state and we're going to declare it. Now, of course, Israel won't want that as the deadline for the 2 years, but if you speak to the most successful entrepreneurs in the West Bank, they will tell you that helping them, the only way to help them is to create an independent Palestinian state, because violence is always right there, and violence comes in and all of a sudden you rip out everything that you've just created for the last year or 2 years. So the objective has to be the independent Palestinian state, final status negotiations. It cannot be the idea you can set this aside and just concentrate on developing the West Bank, because that won't work.
I think I have the word. We've concluded. I want to thank Elliot and Bob and all of you for attending. Thank you very much.